here from the other side of the world, and I'd like to introduce to you Mangharam, who's the Principal Scientific Officer and Inspector of the Human Factors and Ergonomics team at Worksafe. So Worksafe's Human Factors and Ergonomics team addresses hazards that lie within the realms of physical, cognitive, and organizational ergonomics. Jean has a background in physiotherapy and ergonomics industrial hygiene at the University of Cincinnati. She's practiced as a clinical physiotherapist and consultant ergonomist in Australia, UK, and the USA. So she comes to us very well suited to help us tackle this thorny issue. Thank you, Jean.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for the invite to Canada. I loved arriving into Vancouver and looking at those beautiful views. And then, of course, Toronto, the exciting city. Right. Just as an introduction, my talk's going to be about what we do in Western Australia, which, in terms of the size and the geography, if you have a look, it makes up, you most probably can't see the lines very well, but on the left map, it makes up for almost a third of the geography of Western Australia. So it's a large landmass, and Perth sits on the southwest corner, not quite at the corner, but close to it. In terms of the population distribution, so if you have a look on the right side, Australia has a population of 22.7 people at the moment, million people. New South Wales has 7.3, Victoria 5.3, Queensland 4.5, and WA has 2.3 out of the 22.7 million people. So we're looking at a small population that's spread out over a third of the continent. These are some of the, just to give you an idea of some of the challenges we may face in our jurisdiction. Perth has 1.7 million, just slightly south in Mandurah there's 85,000 people. Bunbury, further south for about 3 hours, is 68,000. And if you head inland towards where the gold rush occurred in Kalgoorlie, where many miners are, 32,000. And in Geraldton, up north, where the greatest expansion's occurring at the moment with population growth because of the oil and gas industry, especially natural gas, makes up for 37,000 people. We're having an increase, well, in terms of the population growth, 2.2% last year was the growth. And in terms of relative to Australia, Australia had a population growth of 1.7 million. In terms of workplace demographics, just to give you an idea, 95% of businesses in 2010 had 0 to 19 employees. So we're dealing with small workplaces or self-employed people. In WA, 61% were self-employed and 34% had 1 to 19 employees. Now there's a similar distribution in Australia-wide, 60% self-employed, 35% with small business, which is the second category. However, with WA, the added challenge is that it's so the geographic spread is much greater. So our challenges come in the form of making information simple to understand, to especially small businesses, and systems that are, and assessment methods that are quick and easy to apply, and controls that are practicable for these various regions of Western Australia. Now, Worksafe as an organisation, our primary objective is to promote and secure safety and health in the workplace in Western Australia. Our responsibilities include enforcing of the Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act that came out in 1984. And we're also an agency that's responsible for providing and promoting information to the industry and public about how to prevent these disorders. In terms of our organisation, in terms of what we don't do, is we don't cover Workers' Compensation Act, that act. That's done by WorkCover, so it's a separate organisation. There are sectors that are out of our jurisdiction, like, for instance, the mining industry, the railways, federal government, those that are insured by federal government. There's no research responsibility for Worksafe. We rely on the central body, Safe Work Australia. We're purely government funded, whereas other jurisdictions in Australia, and just to give you an idea, various states have their own jurisdiction in terms of the Occupational Act and regulations. They're very similar systems. It's a three-tier type program, which was based on the Robbins Institute from the UK. So I'm looking at you there, Mike. Thanks to you. Thanks to, yes, your country. So we do have also legislation that says we can't directly use the workers' compensation data that's reported to the workers' comp organisation, but we can use notifiable injuries that are as part of our regulation within Western Australia. That those that lead to more than 10 days off work, employees have to report those injuries to Worksafe. So that gives us an idea of where the specific injuries are happening. However, otherwise we base our strategies on aggregated data, which we do get from WorkCover. In terms of our organisational structure, we have 6 directorates. 3 of them, the top 3, are operational. They're mainly spread out in industry-based directorates and teams. The middle team, Health Hazards and Plant and Safety, have 3 different teams within them. They have scientific officers in the Human Factors and Ergonomics group, which our scientific officers are also inspectors. The Industrial Hygiene team, there's the plant team. But we've also got medical consultants that sit under there and happen to have 2 industries that sit under that branch. So it's quite a mixed branch. Otherwise, the other 2 operational ones are industry-based. And the other directorates are business services, legal, and policy and education. In terms of general statistics for WA, the lost time injuries have reduced over time. So in 09 or 10, we had the lowest recorded LTI since 91-92. 74.2% improvement since the OSH Act came into effect in 88-89. Now, the reason for that, of course, we don't know, but we're seeing that, and we're going to continue trying to do what we're doing as much as we can, but we know that we have to start shifting our focus. We're seeing less traumatic and fatality injuries, traumatic injuries and fatalities, which is great, and much more shift towards musculoskeletal disorders, and certainly the number of inquiries related to psychosocial hazards has increased. So we're showing a typical shift of a developed country, I think, possibly. In terms of the frequency, there's been a 6.4% drop since 08-09, so in 1 year, and in 5 years there's been an 18.6% drop. In terms of severe injuries, severity of injuries, unfortunately, the severity of injuries, so for those that have lasted more than 60 days, they've increased. And I think that pattern's similar in BC. So the severity of injuries have actually increased, the number of severe injuries, those that are requiring more than 60 days off work. So that's to give you an idea of the distribution of the different types of nature of injuries. Sprains and strains right at the top, dominating at 48.3%. Oh, open wounds, much less. I don't have the percentage there, but you can just see the difference. In terms of mechanism of injury, so there are different ways in which workers' compensation data is coded. One is under the nature of injury, and others is sort of mechanism of injury. So in terms of mechanism of injury, musculoskeletal disorders seem to be reported as body-stressing injuries. These are the type of injuries they're coded as. So it's 38% of our mechanisms are due to body-stressing injuries. Being hit by an object is at 22%, and slip, strips, and falls at 21%. So if we look at the sprains and strains, again, 48.3%, that's really owed by most probably 2 mechanisms in general, the body stressing as well as the slip, strips, and falls. in terms of the type of body stressing injuries, they're split up into 4 different types. So the first column tells you about all mechanisms being at 100%. Body stressing claims make up for 41%. Out of all mechanisms, 18% are due to muscular stress while lifting, carrying, or putting down objects. 15% while handling objects other than lifting, carrying, or putting down. So that's most probably due to pushing and pulling. So 15% pushing and pulling. 6% from no objects being handled, muscular stress but no objects being handled. And 2% from repetitive movement and low muscle loading. Now, because of the coding, and I guess we may not really be getting a clear picture of what's happening here, especially when it comes to the number of repetitive injuries that are happening. Because a date of incident has to be put on the form when they go through the workers' compensation process. And to determine whether it's a work-related injury, the GP has to say what it might have been from and whether it's work-related, and he has to work out the probability. And without having a date of injury for many repetitive strain injuries, they may not be classified as that, and workers may not present it that way when they're at the GP. Proportion of body stressing injuries over time. So, as you can see, the drop of frequency of injuries per million hours worked. Out of that, with the body stressing injuries, if you have a look at that proportion, it's been floating between 39%, actually 40%, and 37%, or 37.5%. So there really isn't too much of a change in terms of proportion. Which industries are at risk? So collectively, over the past maybe 10 years, or especially in the last 5 years, each year we tend to analyze which industries are at risk, and these ones always come up. And I guess we have to look at various aspects when we think about high risk in terms of 1+ days off, 60+ days, and frequency rates, so the intensity within that workplace. So for instance, with manufacturing, with food processing, we may not have a high number of lost time injuries because the number of workers in that industry is quite low. However, the frequency rates are so high. So we have a look at a range of statistics that will give us an idea of where the hotspots are as such. And it seems to be health and community, construction, both general and trade services, manufacturing, so that's food and tobacco, food, tobacco, and actually I can't remember, there's one more in that, but it's mainly from the food industry and metal manufacturing. Transport and storage, and retail and wholesale. Overall, as I mentioned, our legislative framework comes from the UK model, influenced by the Robins report, where there's a general act at the top with general duties, and that's statutory law. Then there are regulations which are specific to hazards, and that's also statutory law. Now, to provide employers or duty holders with guidance on how to comply with the regulations, codes of practices are written. Now, codes and practices have to be followed unless, and can be used as evidence in court, as information that's out in the community of how to meet the regulations. However, if the duty holder is able to display that they've done something beyond what's of the process that's described in the code, then that's acceptable. So it's the minimum standard of method in terms of approach for meeting the regulations. We've got one specific manual handling regulation, just one, 3.4, and it requires the employers to identify manual handling hazards, conduct a risk assessment, and consider controls that are available to implement it. Not to actually implement controls, but to consider them. However, what we do is, I'll show you in a few minutes, we can use the other parts of the Act and the regulations to make changes in terms of controls. We had two codes for a long time. The Manual Handling Code of Practice, the last time it was written was in 2000. And for the occupational overuse syndrome, we were using a national code, which was the 94 code. And we were waiting for a long time for a national code to be written. And in 2003, they started doing a lot of research to find out how they could write a combined code for musculoskeletal disorders, with lots of consultation from various jurisdictions. By the time we got to 2007, we had something that was written, and it went through the central body to have a standard and to have a code. Now that's available on the Safe Work Australia website. So that's the 2007 Code of Practice for manual tasks to prevent musculoskeletal disorders. Unfortunately, the uptake of that code was not as widespread as what they would hope it would be. New South Wales picked it up, but what they then did is supplemented that code with simple material on their website, so that was easier to follow. The general consensus from the various jurisdictions is that it was quite complex and bulky, especially for the smaller jurisdictions that had smaller codes. Some didn't accept that there were suggestions of threshold limits or guidelines on when a task is considered hazardous or not. So at this stage, we're in the midst of attempting to rewrite that. And we're due to have harmonized law on the 1st of January 2012. So after that, it's worth looking at the Safe Work Australia website to see what we've got up. And hopefully we've got something up by then. The duty holders in general, employers and self-employed, body corporate, contractors and labour hire, persons in control of workplaces, manufacturers, designers, employers and suppliers, and workers. So there are duties for each one of these holders within the Act and regulations. In terms of using the legislation that we've got for musculoskeletal disorders, the first step is investigation. If an injury occurs, employer must investigate a reported injury and provide feedback within a reasonable, conduct an investigation and provide feedback on the outcome, if any, within a reasonable time frame. And that's under, in our Act as well as in our regulation to support that. They've also got to conduct a risk assessment. So there's a general one for under 3.1, which for some of the occupational overuse syndrome type conditions, so repetitive movement, low loading, that was not related to manual handling. So the manual handling, the definition was mainly related to those that required force, so forceful exertion type of activities. So we had 3.1 to supplement that, but 3.4 is specifically related to manual handling. We've got one to implement controls, provide and maintain workplaces, plant, and systems of work such that so far as practical workers are not exposed to hazards. That's when changes are required, that part of the Act can be used. Training, part of 19.1 is also providing information, instruction and training and supervision for the purpose of reducing the exposure to hazards or the extent of hazards. Now, we've also got one for notifying injuries that will lead to workers, notifying injuries that have led workers to having 10 or more working days off. We may not see that in our national regulation, but certainly for our team in WA, having this part of the Act allows for a lot of reactive activity to occur. So we are able to find out where the musculoskeletal disorders are occurring. Many musculoskeletal disorders will lead to 10 working days or more off work. So it helps us see where the problematic areas are, and we're hoping that we can see this at the national level when national legislation is brought out, but we're not sure if that will be followed through. There are also obligations for those that design plant. Design and construction, for those that design and construct plant, they've got an obligation to those who install, maintain or use and ensure that they're not exposed to hazards, that it's tested and examined, certain plant, and there's adequate information provided to users. We did use this part of the plant in relation to a manual handling hazard that occurred in 2007. There was a fatality that occurred in an aged care setting where related to a portable serial hoist that had detached from its tracking, its overhead track. With the investigations that were done, it was found that the serial hoist, or the overhead hoist, which is considered a serial hoist, did not meet the Australian standards, which is linked to our regulation. It's in our schedule, because it didn't have a closed hook, and it also didn't have a ability to swivel around its hook. So there were a couple of things where it didn't meet design requirements. There was a lot of discussion about whether it was due to the way it was they were trained, or the workers were trained, and whether the workers followed the right procedure. We wrote some notices in relation to ensuring that employers test the system. Otherwise, their systems were adequate for manual handling. But we did follow up with suppliers of this design of this hoist, because it didn't meet the standard, the importers and the suppliers. It doesn't fully fall under our jurisdiction. It also falls under the Therapeutic Goods Act, which looks at what's imported into the country. So we communicated with them, and we wrote an alert out. A coroner's inquest was put forward, and we had to provide evidence on what we'd found. The changes that occurred from it was, number one, we had a safety alert. There were changes that the suppliers and the importers made, so that it's now a closed hook. It meets the Australian standards, so there were design changes. And the coroner followed through with these recommendations, and she was happy to follow through with such as a design fault being possibly the possible cause of the injury. So it's quite a complex one, but certainly that part of our Act and regulation helped to be able to make some changes. Enforcing the law, we've got, in terms of for Worksafe, first of all, just to give you an idea, the preferred method is to educate a workplace. Now, if we're not getting change, and it is apparent that we may not get change, then verbal direction may be given. With verbal direction, inspectors have to be confident that the problem is solved before they leave the workplace. So it's not always easy to provide a verbal improvement direction. With improvement notices, if they find that there is evidence that parts of the Act or regulation are not met, then an improvement notice can be written. A prohibition notice can be written to say that a task must be stopped immediately, because if it causes serious or imminent hazard, according to the inspector's opinion, and that the task may resume once the hazard has been removed. And of course, the next level is prosecution. In 09 or 10, we had 10,800 workplace inspections in the year. We had 10,600 improvement notices, 700 prohibition notices, and 42 convictions. None of them were related to musculoskeletal disorders. The improvement notices that are written in Worksafe WA, 2.2 to 2.5% of them are related to manual handling. We've had one prosecution since 1990, and there's one in preparation at the moment. We're not sure how we'll go with having it up all the way to the level where the state solicitor says, yes, we can put this forward as a prosecution, because it has to meet certain criteria in terms, including public interest, the severity of injury, and also the lawyer has to work out how technical it is and the amount of cost that would be associated with fighting this case. So we have challenges with getting prosecutions up in this realm. Sorry, that's enforcing the law. Revised code of practice, as I mentioned. The limitations, I must say that unfortunately there are limitations to this code that was brought out in 2010. It was written while we were trying to harmonize the laws and having a harmonized code. So they didn't want to create a whole new code. However, they wanted to ensure that, because we hadn't had a renewed code in WA for a while, they wanted to combine the risk factors so that it related to musculoskeletal disorders in general, because we know the interaction of the effect of how the risk factors interact, and sometimes it's very difficult to separate manual handling from occupational overuse syndrome risk factors. The limitations include, in terms of the risk assessment, you'll find that there's a checklist that's quite extensive. There's detailed information, but certainly providing a quick and easy method to assess would be great. It also needs supplementary guides in relation to people handling and cumulative type or dealing with tasks that are related or jobs that may lead to cumulative trauma. So we don't think that it really sufficiently covers the type of information that we had in our occupational overuse syndrome national code. The risk management process: hazard identification, risk assessment, risk control, follow-up. In terms of hazard identification, the employers are expected to check injury hazard reports and other documents, consult workers, supervisors, OSH reps, OSH professionals, observe the manual tasks, collect information and look for trends. The risk assessment, they're expected to look at the risk factors that are direct in terms of actions and postures, such as things as awkward postures, static postures and repetitive movement, forces and loads that may lead to overexertion, and vibration, especially those related to whole body and hand-arm vibration. Now, the indirect risk factors are also listed, so systems of work and work organization, things like the duration and frequency of tasks, the task variety. And there are some psychosocial factors that sort of pop up in that under that area, so in terms of job control, job demand and support. The environmental factors, uneven flooring, lighting, climate, these are the things that fall under it which may have indirect effects. And the worker characteristics which has been also been put under indirect risk factors are things like young workers, those with physical limitations, pregnancy or postpartum, and those with language and cultural barriers. Now, in this code, the new thing about this code is that it prompts the employers to look for the sources of risk. So much for identifying the risk factor and trying to work out, or in this case, give it a subjective assessment of what they think the level of risk is. But what they've got to do in this code is also determine what they think the source of risk is. So if they're having an awkward posture, they're displaying awkward postures or heavy loads, they're pushing heavy loads, why would that be? So they fall under sort of 5 areas: work area, design and layout, nature of the item, equipment or tool, nature of the load, the working environment, and systems of work, work organization and work practices. In terms of controls, they've been put under three levels for the hierarchy of controls, because they've with substitution, the classic substitution engineering controls and so forth, the middle hierarchy, we found that usually you'd need a combination of them, or that engineering controls may sometimes supersede substitution for certain things. So it was decided that we would give it a 3-tier approach instead. The first would be to eliminate. The second would be to look at the second level would be modify work area and layout, or alter the nature of loads, provide, substitute, redesign, or modify items, equipment, or tools, alter the work environment, alter the systems of work organization, work practices. So you can see that those 5 were related to the sources of risk. So what we're hoping with that is that they actually tackle the sources of risk that has led to that risk factor being present to begin with. The third tier would be administrative controls. Training falls under that. And there's 2 forms of training that's expected. For risk management, all levels of management are expected to go through risk management training related to manual handling or manual tasks, and task-specific training for those that actually perform the task, and policies and procedures such as those related to handling of bariatric patients, or how manual handling tasks, risk assessments are conducted would fall under administrative controls at this stage. Although we do know that there are overarching procedures and policies that should most probably be put in place rather than just be sitting in administrative control. So we still have to tackle that and work out where we should be putting that. Follow-up and review, consultation, observe, monitor. Now, the type of work that we do, so in terms of reactive work, they come in through OSH inquiries from the public, from workers, or they're notifiable injuries, which I'd mentioned before, 10 or more working days off work. The investigations are based on those that are referred by industry team managers and by and also we would support industry team inspectors. The investigations are conducted by general inspectors in the various industry teams, as well as those within the ergonomics team. The proactive work that we've done recently in Western Australia, although there's quite a few more, but these are ones that we've done more recently, are those related to musculoskeletal, the injuries that have been reported, what we found the risk factors to be for those reportable injuries. So we had a systematic method of conducting investigations. Manufacturing, food manufacturing, we looked at we supported 2 projects within manufacturing. One was abattoirs and the other was seafood processing. Health and community, home care. Recently we did one on supporting funeral industry. That was also interesting because there are various duty holders that may come into play with addressing manual handling risks. So not only the funeral directors, but also the cemeteries board. The cemeteries board have control over the workplace, while the funeral directors will have control over the systems of work and how the work and whether training is delivered to the workers. So we've had to work out how to get changes in that industry. Construction, occupation-specific resources were written quite some time back. We do need to make, it's quite similar to BC actually, we go through cycles where we would leave off from certain industries for a while and then come back to it when we think that they're ready to tackle MSDs again. Retail and wholesale, manual tasks in supermarkets. It's something that we've done recently. National proactive work. Okay, so the heads of Worksafe authorities, which is not Safe Work Australia, they're basically the jurisdictions that get together. They're trying to target certain high-risk hazards, one of them, or priority hazards. One of them includes musculoskeletal disorders. Those that are related to musculoskeletal disorders, and all of these reports are available on the website if you go to Heads of Worksafe Authorities. Design for Health was in 2004, Safe Steps was in 2007, Surgical Loan Set was most recently done, Manufacturing, we did ours on metal manufacturing, but other states conducted theirs in various other sectors or subsectors within manufacturing, and transport and storage. In terms of just touching bases with what we found with our West Australian, the notifiable injuries and the risk factors, the process was that high-risk industries we highlighted high-risk industries where we wanted managers to refer us notifiable injuries. It was referred to the ergonomics team, and we conducted a standard investigation. A checklist was used for this that included the type of risk factor, the sources of risk that may have led to the injuries, and the type of controls that were put in place. We looked at first degree and primary and secondary risk factors. 33 investigations were conducted, and we found that the employers were more likely to owe their primary risk factors to actions and postures, whereas if it was the inspector that was to say what the primary risk factor was, they would say it's a balance of actions and postures or forces and loads. In terms of the sources of risk, the inspectors felt that nature of load made up for about 31% of the injuries, or 31% of the injuries. Systems of work, 23%. The equipment was 19%, and the environment was 13%. For supermarkets, 21 inspections were conducted. This was done last year, 8 in the regional area and 13 in the metropolitan. This is, the type of intervention or the process included consultation, a checklist, a media release, an information resource kit that we provided to the workplace, the inspections to look at and to provide education and enforcement during the inspections, an industry seminar feedback, and we're updating the website with the findings. 146 enforcement activities were conducted, 56 improvement notices, 90 verbal. The sources of risk factors, 35% were owed to equipment, 10% to stock issues, 10% risk assessment, 10% training. In terms of the equipment issues, those especially related to trolleys, ladders, pallets, pallet jacks, stock issues, stock heights, overcrowding, and training, they were either not provided or there's no refreshment, or it wasn't a risk management approach that was given. I'll move on now to something a little bit more unusual, and that's a surgical loan set, a national. It's just about, I think it's just been put up on the website of New South Wales website. Now, this one's an interesting one. So what New South Wales did is, after our Design for Health campaign, which is in 2004, it prompted changes and to look at CSSD, so the those that actually, the cleaning department for surgical instruments. And they realized that there was a problem with handling surgical loan sets. So there was they worked with designers to look at prototypes on how these surgical loan sets would be delivered, and they've been now created. They worked with couriers as well as the hospitals in terms of different equipment and environmental changes that can be done. So this rollout of enforcement will occur over the next few years in WA. The education resources we have, Code of Practice. Our website has lots of publications. We've got a video, we've got public forums and workshops that we deliver to the workplace. I'm not going to show the manual task risk management video, but we do have a manual task risk management video which goes through the whole process that's described in the manual task Code of Practice. Building organizational capacity, training new inspectors, training existing inspectors. There are challenges with that. We try to do them during team meeting presentations, skill development sessions, field mentoring, manual task, industry-specific education, packs, audit checklists, sample notices, support investigations. We also train the community education staff, so we provide them with technical information so that they can deliver this across various industries and to various stakeholders. We provide feedback to the executive management on strategic planning, and also provide some training to visiting students. The partnerships that we've built, WorkCover, so our Workers' Compensation Board, the WA Health Department, Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, Curtin University, University of Western Australia, the Arthritis Foundation, Australian Rehabilitation Providers Association, and of course the tripartite stakeholders, unions, Chamber of Commerce, various industries and professional specific organisations. The harmonization process, which is taking place now, there are various processes and activities that are being done, and the outcomes that will come from it include an act, regulations, codes of practices. There'll be one for manual tasks, which is now being drafted, and the vibration one hasn't commenced yet in terms of drafting it, but that's a non-priority code of practice, but that's on the radar. The various types of penalties and how they're cited. In terms of operations, how inspections will be conducted and enforcement, so there'll be some nationalising on that. Inspector training, that might actually be also nationalised and harmonised. And guides and educational material. Oops. Not able to get this to go forward. Ah, here we go. Right. Sorry. There we go. Resources. At the national level, I'd point you to Safe Work Australia. It has research material as well as the Code of Practice from 2007. And the heads of Worksafe authorities have the reports of all those projects that I'd mentioned. Within state jurisdictions, wonderful material from Worksafe Victoria. Their code is different from Western Australia's. It's much more detailed, but they've also got some very good industry-specific documents. Workplace Health and Safety Queensland has a lovely code of practice for handling of people. WorkCover New South Wales has a simple way in which they have simplified the code, the national code of practice, and made it applicable to small businesses as well as large businesses. That's what they focused on, or tried to. Also they've got some lovely research material. And SafeWorks South Australia has definitely a code that's simple like Western Australia, and various industry-specific material as well. Take-home message for employers: management commitment and perseverance, consultation, a risk management approach, intervene at all levels of prevention, primary, secondary and tertiary. So Tom Armstrong had mentioned the fact that we are not to neglect our secondary and tertiary prevention levels, and unfortunately we are working at those levels. And if we were to analyse our workers' compensation data more closely, we may find that a high percentage or a proportion of our musculoskeletal disorders are not first-time reports of musculoskeletal disorders by an individual. Coordinated program has to be instilled within a workplace for it to work, because various departments will have to communicate, and various levels of management. Apply multifaceted intervention. There isn't one solution. Apply hierarchy of controls. Explore interventions from other industries rather than just saying this is always how we've done. This is the way we've done it all the time. Further work, policy, education and awareness, making sure that we've got some tiered educational material, those that are that's simple and easy to use, as well as that has adequate technical information for larger companies and professionals. Strategies to disseminate information to some of those isolated areas. Legal, we're hoping to get them to have at least a musculoskeletal disorder priority at some stage. The Commissioner has said that he is agreeable to that. Inspectorate operation, increase the inspector's understanding of the hazard and how to enforce it. Certainly scientific officers to attract and retain. For external stakeholders, we'll have to create new partnerships for this to work, and most probably what we do need is drive from various angles for us to make a difference with this. Enforcement alone is not going to make a difference, and we've recognised this in Worksafe Western Australia. So we would like the Health Department, Workers' Compensation Board, even the GPs, the insurance companies, professional bodies in the industry, stakeholders, to have some input into this. So this is the next strategy that we'll be taking, is creating partnerships and hitting this hazard from various angles. Funding, exploring options for that, and research, it's not optimal at this stage, but in terms of accessing and strategic use of data would be good. The gaps that exist, which appear to exist in most jurisdictions, or the challenges that we find with enforcing and legislating, is that gap between science and policy, the science between legislation and enforcement. How easy is it to enforce legislation that's been written? So for the inspectors to actually understand and be confident to enforce. Technical detail and the employee's capacity in terms of the time that they have and their understanding of the subject. Best practice and practicability in terms of technology and costs, especially for the small businesses, and authorities and intervention continuum. Sorry, that took some time. Thank you. Sorry, that's a picture of the tea. Any questions?
My name is Linda Sagmeister. I'm an ergonomist working with occupational health and safety, actually in Newfoundland and Labrador, as an inspector.
Yes.
My question is with regards to the ceiling lift issue you had
Yes.
mentioned. Did I hear you correctly that you said the design of the ceiling lift
Yes.
was linked somehow, or the requirements of the design was linked
Did
to your
not meet
regulation?
our regulation. That's right.
Could you explain what that link
We
is?
point to certain Australian standards that are pointed in our schedule, in our regulation, and certain plant and other Australian standards related to ladders and so forth. I don't have the regulation in front of me, but there are various hazards where Australian standards are used to provide an explanation for minimum compliance that are linked to the regulation. And one of them is serial hoists, and overhead hoists do fall under that category as serial winch hoists.
Okay, thank you.
Mm.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Good morning. Last week at a meeting of the Research Action Alliance on the consequences of workplace injury,
Yes.
it was indicated that Australia has removed a program called experience rating, where it's an incentive program to employers to keep their injuries and lost time injuries down. Is that correct?
That might be in a different state. I'm
Okay.
sorry, it wasn't in Western Australia.
Okay, I was
Um,
wondering if it was it seems like you have a overarching national
That's
strategy.
being developed at this stage.
Okay.
Yes. So they're hoping to have it into effect on the 1st of January 2012. It'll imagine it takes 6 months at least for it to be established and rolled out and so forth. But I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
I'd be interested to hear about it if you've got my contact details,
Sure. Thank you.
especially since we're looking at partnerships in the future and making changes from various angles to try and reduce this problem. Thank you.